Kia ora koutou and greetings from Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is Marek Tesar and I'm chairing the Ritchie Steering Committee. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education Ritchie webinar, Land Education, Place and Climate Justice in Early Childhood. I would like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people on whose land we are connecting today to this webinar. This webinar is organized and sponsored by Ritchie, the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education organization, which is focused on a critical approach to early childhood education and childhood studies. We also focus on scholarship and activism, and as an organization, we share a concern about privileging particular sets of beliefs or forms of knowledge that typically reflect Western or Eurocentric values, and that they can create a power for certain groups of people and oppress others. Ritchie is a broad and welcoming international organization, and on behalf of the Ritchie Steering Committee, I would like to welcome you all to join us by visiting our website that you can see on the slide and become active members. We also want to acknowledge all teachers, families and children who are affected by the pandemic, and these days many of our thoughts are with our colleagues in India. I have received this morning an email from colleagues in Delhi who wish that could be with us today, but they need to care for their close ones. I received another note from a colleague in Kenya to know that electricity is available only during particular hours each day, making it challenging for them to join online events. So I do not want to take our opportunity to meet here in an online space and to be connected for granted. Today's Ritchie webinar, Land Education, Place and Climate Justice in Early Childhood, has nearly 400 registered participants. To avoid distraction, both the chat and Q&A features will be closed while the speakers are spotlighted. We will open the Q&A and raise hand functions for the final 15 to 30 minutes, at which time we will take questions from the audience. During the session, all expert speakers are muted. For those who wish to interact with other participants, following the planned 90-minute program, stay on for an additional 30 minutes for an informal salon conversation at the end. Please also note that this meeting is being recorded. And it's my great privilege and pleasure to thank some really important people. I would like to deeply thank the virtual events or virtual engagement team committee, and particularly Sonia Arndt and Jenna Goebel and Margarita Ruiz Guerrero were coordinators for this event. But special thanks to the rest of the whole virtual events committee for the leadership of this webinar and the whole webinar series. Beth Bruce-Wadener, Mimi Bloch, Lacey Peters, Janice Kroger, Rachel Langford, and Mark Nagasawa. We also want to thank the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University, who've been just amazing and provided technical support of this event, especially their event coordinator, Jeanne Colcat. And just as a reminder, this is just one of many different webinars and events that Ritchie is organizing. So stay tuned for more announcements and join Ritchie, become members, become involved and support our vibrant community. You will know first about our future events, including this fantastic webinar in May called Feminism, Gender Justice and Resistance in Early Childhood Education, featuring many of our Ritchie friends and colleagues as speakers. And with that, I would like to introduce today's webinar chair and moderator, Dr. Megan Bank. Megan Bank, Ojibwe and Italian descent, is a professor of the learning sciences and psychology at Northwestern University and is the senior vice president at the Spencer Foundation. She is particularly interested in knowledge organization, reasoning, and decision-making about complex socio-ecological systems and their intersections with identity, cultural variations, history, and power. Name Hinui, and until we can all meet together again in person, take care in these strange times. Megan, over to you to introduce us to today's themes and speakers. Kia ora.
Buju Budabin de Kwe Indigenous Cost Anishinaabe Kwe Gagoon and the Dem. Thank you all for having me. I'm honored to be here and host what will be an amazing panel tonight. I want to just tell you all that I am coming from my ancestral territories that is often known in the English language as Chicago, and hope that all of you take time to acknowledge the territories that you're in. It's my honor tonight to be able to introduce our panel and give some kind of framing comments. And so I'm going to start by just saying, going through our panelists and then turning it over to them after a couple of comments. So welcome to Diana Gómez, who is coming from Dublin City University in the Institute for Education. And sorry, I'm having trouble navigating. Dr. Annalise, who is an associate professor at Western Washington University. Dr. Jeanne Ritchie, who is coming to us from Wellington. And I was gonna not tell anyone at their university, so I'm gonna stop doing this. So Dr. Catherine Hamm, who's coming to us from Australia, and Dr. Jean-Marie Iorio also from Australia. And I want to just give a couple of comments before I get to our excellent speakers today to sort of say about why this focus on land education, place, and climate justice in early childhood education. And I'm going to start by just giving a couple of my own thoughts about this that I hope that each of our panelists will expand, will challenge, will broaden perspectives on from both their own experiences and the territories that they come from. So for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about this idea of land and water-based education, and it comes from a long history of being taught that places produce and teach particular ways of thinking about and being in the world. And they tell us the way things are, even when they operate pedagogically beneath the conscious level. And for me, I've thought for a long time about how it is that we came to think about education as a place inside a building, rather than happening actually in and on our lands and waters. And this work is thought, for me, over a long period of time, has come to really recognize about what the difference is between being and learning with lands and waters and learning about them. And a scholar that I think a lot with, has taught me a lot, has talked about that in Indigenous education, it's not Indigenous or education from within our own intellectual traditions unless it comes through the land, unless it occurs in an Indigenous context using Indigenous processes. And Vine Deloria said a long time ago that our challenge was recreating the conditions within which our knowledge systems and our ways of knowing thrived in whatever context and time we lived in. In making sense of this over time, one of the things that I think becomes really important is about our fundamental relationships and views of more than human others. And for me, and from the places that I've learned and come to, is to recognize that a core question is what is our responsibility as human species, and what are the core relationships between humans and more than humans that we're cultivating and thinking about. And in my own work, I have come to see this as fundamentally a question of the kinds of relationships between the natural world, more than humans, and cultural worlds. And I'm being deliberate here about really pushing on some of the Western ways that kind of a nature culture boundary is talked about, because even constructing a boundary is a particular perspective. And this just comes from work where we can think a lot about how this core relationship structures everything around human activity, sense making, infrastructure. It impacts our values, our knowledge systems, our ways of being. It is mediated and has been shaped significantly in different ways through power and over time or history. But as early childhood educators, I think a lot about how it shapes our views of human development and cognition, and what it is we think we should be learning and how we should be learning it in learning environments. And so I want to pose a question, sort of graphic, is what are our foundational models between the natural world or the more than human world and human worlds that are at the core of how we engage in early childhood education? Part of why I think it's really important today that we continue to think about is how and why is this very fundamental question connected to climate justice? And I kind of use this slide at every opportunity I have. And the question is what kinds of humans are we cultivating? And where does it lead us to? And this slide, the purple is the claimed continuous territories of Indigenous peoples. And I like to make sure people recognize a quarter of all land is still in Indigenous hands and being managed by Indigenous peoples in the world. Most people don't know that because of global erasure of indigeneity. The other thing that I think is really important as we think about climate justice issues, that 80% of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous territories. And yet 95% of climate change hotspots are indigenous territories. Part of the point here is that there is a deep connection between the fundamental relationships between human people and more than humans that is undergirding education and the global outcomes of things like biodiversity and issues of climate justice. So without much further ado, I want to say that I hope that I anticipate that we'll hear lots of different connections to these bigger ideas and ways that people are pushing on and trying to and thinking about these things in early childhood contexts. For speakers, just to remind you our order, and I'd like to turn it over to Deanna.
Okay. Hi. Just give me a minute. Okay. Thank you, Megan, for the introduction, and thanks for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. For everyone, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I am speaking to you from Bogotá. It's 7:07 here. So speaking of Colombian peasant communities and Colombian peasant children, take me inevitably to my childhood memories and to my roots, to the high and cold mountains in my country. A territory where I would like to live and work, although I try to avoid the idyllic image of rural life. When I started my doctoral research, I saw the need of having a better understanding of young children's spaces and experiences in rural territories, with the goal of having a critical approach to public policies for peasant communities, children, and families in Colombia. I set out to transcend the deficit discourse in relation to rural realities and recognize the peasant historical, political, social, and cultural conditions in which particular forms of childhood are socially and culturally constructed. Today, I want to share with you part of this work, giving special attention to the peasant's relation to land, nature, and climate justice. To start with, I want to draw on a definition of the peasant and the peasantry. Then I will talk about the relation of the peasantry and the peasant movement to land, nature, and climate justice, and how this relation influences the conceptualization of peasant childhoods. So we all recognize that many different communities live in rural territories around the world, as Megan just mentioned. Each community is highly heterogeneous and is situated in specific social, political, and historical contexts. A rural territory can be understood as a geographic space with a social, economic, and cultural identity. In other words, a rural territory is a social construction. Consequently, any approach to rural communities requires the recognition and comprehension of the diverse communities who live in those territories. It is the case of Colombia, with its peasant, indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities. As I mentioned earlier, I will focus on peasant communities, comunidades campesinas, also known as the peasantry, or el campesinado. Colombian peasants are intercultural and historical subjects with memories, knowledges, and practices which constitute ways of peasant culture based on family and neighborly life for the production of food, common goods, and raw materials. Peasants have an active communal life, which is connected with the land and integrated with nature and territory. The peasant is a subject who is settled in rural areas and nearby urban towns, where peasants have developed a small and medium-scale agricultural production for their self-supply and for market participation at the local and national level. There are political, autobiographical, relational, cultural, economic, and legal reasons for peasants' dependence on and attachment to the land. However, there are extrinsic issues affecting this connection negatively. In Colombian rural areas, people have been historically affected by the internal armed conflict and forced displacement, which have threatened the safety and dignity of rural communities. Because of the loss of homes and economic activities, peasants' livelihoods have disappeared. However, armed conflicts are not the only reason for dispossession of land. The peasantry struggles against industrial agribusiness corporations, mining companies, and aggressive methods of eradicating crops which are used for illegal purposes. An example of this is the aerial fumigation of coca crops with glyphosate, which is a policy imposed on Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, and Afghanistan by the U.S. Department of State. Glyphosate is a toxic chemical with negative effects on nature, on human health, and communities. On nature, glyphosate is related to the pollution of water bodies, deforestation, the modification of soil composition, the reduction of food availability, and the negative alteration of animals' behavior and soil fauna. What is more, glyphosate is carcinogenic, affecting people's health and women's reproductive health. For communities, this this process of aerial, it's another cause of forced displacement. Certainly, these circumstances are a violation of the civil, political, economic, and social and cultural rights of children and peasant communities. Despite this dramatic situation, grassroots peasant communities face and resist through collective movements. One of the most important movements is La Vía Campesina, which groups together different rural organizations from 81 countries around the world. La Vía Campesina points out that while the industrial food system is one of the main drivers of global warming, peasant agroecology and food sovereignty offer a solution for the reduction of the environmental degradation, the adaptation to climate changes, and the realization of social and climate justice. Additionally, many peasant and indigenous communities are considered guardians of the forests because of their relationship with the environment and their knowledge of the ecological systems, contributing to the protection and conservation of the environment. Now, this complex context entails a multidimensional understanding of childhood experiences in which the peasant culture, relations to land, place, and climate justice shape children's identity. Young children are immersed in this family and communal life, learning from all social events around them and participating in the everyday life of home and peasant work. Within rural communities, the actions of grassroots peasant organizations turn into a pedagogical space where young children learn with adults their knowledge and values of their community. Thus, the life of young children is crossed by the struggles of their communities, in which the practices of education and care are not only located in Essex settings, but the education, care, and rearing of young children have to do with extrinsic and structural aspects of the peasant communal life. Disparities and inequalities in rural territories will not be overcome under the assumption of Essex services as the panacea for the realization of young children's rights. But the realization of young children's rights demands structural changes in the development of policies in which the child is recognized as a member of a specific community and a specific culture. In this sense, peasant communities have advocated for local educational policies that recognize the epistemological diversity of the world as a way of bringing social justice for young children. That's it for me. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would like to pass it on to Dr. Lees.
Thank you, Megan and Diana. Okay. Ani Annalise Indigenous Cause Waganaka Singo Dawa Nada Michigan Dodum, Sheboygan, Michigan Donjaba, Manawa Doden, Manawa, Washington Doden. So hi everyone, I'm Annalise from the Little Traverse Bay Bands Wadawa Indians Turtle Clan on my mom's side. I'm originally from Sheboygan, Michigan, and have lived here 6 years now in Coast Salish territories in Washington and the Pacific Northwest of the United States, where I am faculty in the early childhood program at Western Washington University. I'm going to share today work that I have been lucky to engage in with a local Coast Salish tribal nation early learning program to develop a land-based curriculum focused on language revitalization. And so to say just a little bit about that project before I get started, the tribe that I've been working with has been doing this work for decades in working to revitalize language and with a really strong focus for about the last 10 years on beginning that work with their early childhood program. The early childhood program is a pretty large center. They have 14 infant and toddler classrooms and 10 preschool classrooms. Those classrooms have lead teachers who are mostly white women. The infant and toddler side has a few more tribal citizens working in the classrooms than the preschool side, but mostly non-native teachers working with children in those classrooms. And then they work in partnership with the tribal language department, who has all tribal citizens working to learn language through an apprenticeship model where they're also then teaching in the classroom as they build their competency as well. So I've been working with this group for about 2 years now, where the early learning director really decided that she wanted to, as she said, get serious about language revitalization, but do so in a different curricular way. And she wanted to really focus on language curriculum that was relevant and meaningful and came from that community, that place, and those lands and waters. And so I will talk today about some examples of that, and with a focus on building relations and curriculum with Cedar. Before I do that, I want to name a little bit about the intentions of this work that have been very clear from the leadership within the tribe, as well as some limitations. And so starting with intentions, when I was invited into this work, the early learning director and the language director were very clear in their commitments to early childhood, in that building children's relations with lands and waters would help them grow into the humans that they wanted to see for the world. So kind of speaking back to Dr. Bang's call here of what types of humans are we cultivating, they were really clear in seeing that land education connected with language revitalization would build toward the future that they envisioned for the next generations, which was an exciting place to begin, to have leadership who really felt strongly about that and were putting resources in to make it happen. This also is happening within a school setting. And so again, as Dr. Bang opened us with asking about like, why is education bound to schools? And in this representation, or this example that I'm talking about today, it mostly is. And I'll talk about some specifics of where we've been hung up with that. But as we're guided by so many who've done this work before us, I've been thinking these last couple of weeks as I'm back and forth to this site, building and revising curriculum with them, how much of it is happening inside. And Dr. Leanne Simpson makes a reference in one of her pieces that Nana Bojo, a character in our community, or a person in our community, would not sit behind a desk and write about land education, and we're doing a lot of that. And so I want to put that out there, that we have strong intentions about what this work should look like with young children, and we're still mostly limited to the indoors. And we'll get to how I'm making sense of that. So an important place that we began, and we've been in lots of different directions of trying to make this work come to be, but this past summer really sat down with the leadership, with the language department, to think about what does a curriculum entail for children within that tribal nation for the futures that they're working towards, and developed a unit calendar that was guided by the month, the seasons, and community cultural practices. I include the month here intentionally as I talk about limitations to the work, in that while we developed a calendar that's very much grounded in seasonal and cultural practices, it still is also made to work with the school-based calendar. And so I won't get into details about that now, and would be happy to talk later. But it's been very clear as we've built this work out that the boundaries of being guided by weeks and months have impacted how the curriculum represents seasonal practices. Also important to note that they've taken a strong lens around tribal sovereignty with this. The curriculum opens with connections to treaties and land and water relations that thread throughout the remaining units, with an emphasis on relations with lands, water, and more than humans. So talking about inherent sovereignty and political sovereignty, and how young children make sense of that through their relations with each other, relations with other communities, and relations with more than humans. And then throughout the unit throughout the curriculum, there are units for each seasonal change of the 4 seasons and harvesting practices that occur throughout the year. So we will dive in. I wanted today to take some time to just kind of bring to life what, at least in this community, land education within a school setting is looking like. And so I'm going to show some examples of how the CEDAR unit has come to be within classroom settings. This has been during COVID, and I won't get into the details of how all of that has impacted the work, but it has placed the classroom teachers, who again are primarily white, non-Native women, working in the Tribal Early Learning Center to be the primary facilitators of the culture and language curriculum, with supports that have been developed in a variety of ways. And so they, this fall, implemented the CEDAR unit as it was designed for the first iteration of the work. And this unit emphasizes teachings from the CEDAR, gifts from CEDAR, and harvesting protocols within the community. What I'm going to show are examples of what this has looked like with children in classrooms. And I say in classrooms again on purpose. When we were designing this unit, we walked the area in every direction around the early learning program to find where CEDAR was living near us, that children could walk to and engage with through language and culture curriculum, and found that there were no CEDAR living within walking distance from the Early Learning Center. So anybody who has been in this region in Washington may know that we were surprised by that. And so we did different things in the planning to bring CEDAR into the classroom, to help children build that relationship with CEDAR as they build their identity as Coast Salish tribal community members, and the responsibilities that they hold in that relationship with CEDAR towards the future. And so here we have some examples of actual engagement that they were able to have with CEDAR in this classroom, to have that sensory experience, to build their understandings, and they did imprints of cedar. They made cedar oil. You can see the little one here at the bottom left smelling and really examining cedar. They also did more abstract representations. So as the children were working to build models of cedar and come to understand harvesting protocol, the teachers brought outer bark and inner bark of cedar into the classroom. You can see they're learning language with the different parts of cedar. The language is also more, I'll just say for folks doing language revitalization, is moving beyond what we see here of vocabulary for children to use language in context, but you can see that they have the text as well as the images, and the children are seeing it, using and hearing the language, and having the actual representations of cedar in classroom as well as the abstract visual representations. And then they're working to have playful experiences too. So as they, as you saw in the previous slide, engaging with outer bark and inner bark of cedar, using the picture representations, and then as they learned and practiced protocol for harvesting, you can see on the left, they have what they've made up as a portion of a cedar trunk, and then on the right where they were able to engage the protocol, do dramatization, and pretend to strip the cedar tree. With just a couple more minutes, I'll say we've talked a lot, and I want to bring in at least one voice from one of the language teachers that's been working with this about how the work is happening right now and what she imagines it to be. So she says, I do think it would be nice for the students to even go out and harvest cedar, maybe have them learn how to strip the cedar themselves with adult supervision. I can show them pictures of being out on the water, and I can show them pictures of us harvesting and gathering, but they're not going to understand until they actually do it. Their process of learning isn't really being shown flashcards and repeat after me. They want to experience stuff. And so I wanted to include this to say that we're excited about what's been happening, and what's been happening in this iteration of the efforts of language revitalization through land education. It's just the beginning of where this community is working to go. I'll close with this, with another aspect of the work that I've been engaged in around land education, teacher professional development. And I won't go into this, but what I'll say is that as we've been building curriculum with teachers in classrooms, we're also thinking about what do early learning teachers need to be able to engage land education with young children. And first and foremost, they need to build relationships with land, water, and place where they're situated. And we're doing this with both primarily white teachers in school settings, as well as Indigenous teachers in tribal early learning settings, in order to be on and with the land, to develop those relationships in order to be able to foster children's development in that way more intentionally. And so I will leave it at that. And Shamigwach, thank you very much. And I will pass it back.
Thank you so much, Anna. We will move to our next speaker. I'm so excited for conversation after each of these. But Dr. Jenny Ritchie.
Okay, kia ora tātou. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nā mihi mahana kia tātou katoa, ko hui mai nei, tēnei ata. Ki nā iwi take o te ao katoa, ki te mana whenu o tēnei rohe, o te awa, ko Ngāti tō rangatira, tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ki nā kaipaka haere, nā mihi kia koutou mo tēnei tūranga, ki nā atua katoa, Mauri ora kia tātou katoa. So I want to start by talking about on my daily walks in the forest at the end of my street. Every day I'm called to reflect on the state of our planet. As I leave the tarmac and enter into this embrace of the forest, I immediately get the sense of entering a different space. It's a microclimate, a microcosm of continuity, of endless time, a sense of sanctuary from the harsh extremes of the rain, the wind, whatever's happening around. Once you're in the forest, it's completely a different feeling. And the embrace of the canopy of the ancient trees just provides a sense of protection and solace that is a source of spiritual well-being. Trees are interconnected symbiotically with vines and with fungi that are interconnecting, forming communities of mutual benefit. The coexistence and the co-evolution, co-generated over eons. And part of this process has been the sequestration of carbon. Deforestation, stripping the planet of these long-established climate stabilization systems, is a major contributor to climate change. A recent climate report from the World Meteorological Organization describes how our oceans are absorbing the excess heat as our planet warms. The majority of the excess energy that accumulates in the Earth's system due to increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases is taken up by the ocean, and the added energy is warming the ocean. And at the same time, the oceans are absorbing the excess carbon from the greenhouse gases that's being released into the atmosphere. And this carbon is causing acidification of the oceans, which is dissolving the shells of crustaceans, which is a source of seafood for many Indigenous people. So ocean heat storage and acidification, as they increase, this diminishes the ocean's capacity to moderate climate change. As our polar ice caps and glaciers melt, raising the sea levels to the detriment of our neighboring low-lying Pacific islands, and I guess islands elsewhere around the planet. We continue to pump more and more groundwater to the surface to not only hydrate ourselves and provide our own sustenance through watering our agricultural crops, but also we irrigate lawns and golf courses and sporting areas. And here in our country, Aotearoa, many regions require substantial irrigation to satisfy the demands of intensified dairy farming. And through all these endeavours, all these human endeavours, we are actually altering the redistribution of water on the surface of our planet. So as you can see on the slide, we're actually shifting the Earth's axis through the shifting around of the water on the surface of the planet. And that's another measure of the Anthropocene. Human endeavour through the impacts of an exploitative economic system is thus destabilising the balances sustained by long-standing symbiotic interrelationships that underpin the survival of life on our planet. I've been wondering about the recent anthropause, which was a period of time when the threat of COVID-19 created a break in the relentless human onslaught on our environment and caused many of us to pause momentarily, at least, to sort of reflect and recalibrate some of our purposes and priorities. And a crucial learning from that time is that we actually can drastically and radically change our human behaviour almost overnight if we have the mandate to do so. Bruno Latour wrote, hence the incredible discovery. Already in the world economic system, there was, hidden from us all, a bright red alarm button with a nice big stainless steel handle that the heads of state could pull one after the other to instantly stop the train of progress with all the brakes squealing. Latour urges a reconceptualization away from production as the overriding principle of our relationship to the world. Instead of focusing on socialisms limited just to the redistribution of the benefits of the economy, it might now be more a matter of inventing a socialism that contests production itself, and which recognizes that injustice is not just about the redistribution of the fruits of progress, says Latour, but about the very manner in which the planet is made fruitful. Latour believes that recognition of Gaia as life is key, since the big climate questions can make individuals feel small and impotent. But the virus, he writes, gives us a lesson. If you spread from one mouth to another, you can viralize the world very fast. That knowledge can re-empower us. In our work in early childhood education, we can draw on Erica Berman's 2019 Child as Method approach, in which she focuses on the intersection between the political economy of childhood and geopolitical dynamics, alongside considering how such local and global relations must figure as part of a post-colonial, anti-patriarchal, anti-capitalist project. And this involves not only resisting hegemonic discourses, but also reaffirming Indigenous values and practices, and exploring ways in which the interplay of such decolonial approaches might resist, challenge, and reframe the dominance of local, national, and international forces of globalization and neo-colonization. Rosie Braidotti, in a chapter written in 2016, called for a post-human critical theory, which recognizes that disidentification from established patterns of thought is crucial for an ethics and politics of inquiry that demands respect for the complexities of the real-life world we are living in. Her alternative ethics include recognition of our relationality within a network of more than human relations, animal, vegetable, viral, and technological, the principle of non-profit, and emphasis on the collective, including one's territorial or environmental interconnections. There are many resonances again here with Indigenous onto-epistemologies. So very prescient in her 2016 chapter that Braidotti included viral as a component of our interrelationalities, and that she interprets both Foucault and Deleuze's analyses of crisis as, in her words, an injection of lucidity, a dose of sobering wisdom about our real life conditions that resonate with us and we with it. Braidotti highlights the recognition of our interconnection with both human and more than human others as a source of realization, a repositioning of becoming human amidst the painful contradictions of the Anthropocene moment, when the waves of world history, she writes, may be about to erase from the sandy shores of this planet the face of a species that will have been our own. It's been recognized by many Indigenous people, including the Native American climate scholar John Waterhouse, who is of Shikalam, Chippewa, and Cree descent, that the future of our planet lies in Indigenous ways of living on the earth. Indigenous people's wisdom can inform the revisioning of this project that is urgently required in response to the multiple intersecting crises facing humanity and our planet. The biodiversity loss that is contributing to a sixth great extinction, the exponentially escalating, devastating impacts of the climate emergency, and the increasing social injustice and inequality as disparities between rich and poor, both within and between countries, widen under the economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and through climate change-induced migration. Indigenous people have been at the forefront of challenging the onslaught of destruction of the world's diversity. And as Megan pointed out, they protect 80% of the global biodiversity. Indigenous worldviews recognize the interconnectedness and interrelationality of people and planet. For example, for Māori, Papatuanuku, planet Earth, is our mother, recognized as the source of life and nurture for everything that exists within the biosphere. For Indigenous peoples, the desecration of our Earth mother and her children, or her descendants, including humans, as well as animals, plants, insects, fish, and so on, that desecration is a source of grief and trauma. Māori and other Indigenous youth have been at the forefront of climate and other environmental activism. For example, Makasa Looking Horse, who was a 22-year-old water protector from the Mohawk, Wolf Clan, and Lakota in Six Nations of the Grand River, Ontario, Canada, who's been working in the area of raising awareness of environmental racism, recognizes that humans must build a stronger spiritual reconnection to our mother, the earth, an ethical relationship with creation, a natural bond. If that existed among all nations, we would not be facing the catastrophic crisis we're in today. Māori conceptualizations of care for the earth mother, Papatuanuku, and sky father, Ranginui, resonated deeply with young children in our previous study. So they were concerned about the human carelessness, desecrating the beaches, skies, and lands, and fostering such dispositions for care for our planet can be foundational in generating ethics and activism in service of our planet. I've just got a couple of slides to finish off. This is, these are two children from a particular kindergarten where they'd been talking about Papatūānuku, the Earth Mother, and Ranginui, the Sky Father, and how they were separated to create space for all the children, all the life in the biosphere. And the children showing great empathy for the story and for what it really empathizing with Ranginui and Papatūānuku, the Sky Father, and the Earth Mother. So you can see how Lily talks about Rangi, the Sky Father, being at the top, close to the children. You can't see the baby because the baby, Uaumoko, is another atua, another god who's the god of earthquakes, who's inside the earth, inside Papatūānuku. And in the creation story, Rangi and Papa are separated, and the children separate their parents to create the space and light. And the Earth Mother wasn't so close to Rangi anymore. So sad, she writes. And this is a story by another child in this kindergarten who was talking about the Earth Mother, Papatūānuku, had too much rubbish on her because someone had dropped too much rubbish on her. I didn't know who dropped it on her. Rangi, this is her own creative story here. Rangi actually saved her because he threw all the rubbish away in the rubbish bin. It's a really naughty, I'm finished. A really naughty person that dropped the rubbish on Papatūānuku. They didn't have a rubbish bin. The naughty person is in jail now. So I just wanted to finish with those children's voices to show you how children can deeply empathize with Indigenous perspectives when they can have access to them in their early childhood setting. Kia ora tātou. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ritchie. Our next speakers are up. Our next co-presenters, I believe, Dr. Hamm and Dr. Iorio.
You there, Catherine?
I'm here. Here I am. Just wait for you to get the slides up.
Hold on, I'm doing it. It's like so slow. Hold on. All right. How's that? Can you see it?
Perfect. Hello, everybody, wherever you might be, morning, afternoon, or evening. We would like to begin with acknowledging the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations, where our work and our lives are located. We pay respect to elders past and present and emerging, and the deep knowledge is embedded within the Aboriginal community and the ongoing connection of and care for country. We also acknowledge that our connections with place provoke learning with more than human others as we learn with and care for sky country, the waterways and the land. Next slide, please.
There we go.
That's it.
How to figure out how to
In this time of, oh, there we go. All right. In this time of Earth's environmental crisis, children are experiencing global childhoods that must include ongoing responses to climate emergencies. Innovative pedagogies for climate action that support learning with place are required. In response to the lack of relationship between humans and the planet, evident in the human-induced calamitous state of the environment that Jenny just shared with us, learning with place supports children and teachers to build deep relationships with their local environments. These radically new relationships are the impetus for rethinking and reshaping decision-making and actions that generate the conditions for human and more than human others to flourish and live well together, as Haraway writes from 2016. Learning with local places calls for a commitment to time needed for building deep relationships with place. Sustained moments, crossing creek, encountering bark, listening with ant, following baby skink, who's a small lizard for those people not familiar with skink, following baby skink into the dry creek bed, make visible relations with place and more than human others that inhabit these places. In particular, these moments articulate what calls humans into connection, a term that we draw from Deborah Bird-Rose. Within the place, acknowledging Indigenous ways of knowing that are always present as we walk with places. Our local places hold histories and stories of colonial futures, pasts, and presents. Learning with our local places generates moments for humans and more than human others to think and act towards a common future that responds to the ethics and politics of local places.
So in order to do this work, we activate what Donna Haraway describes as environmental justice, nurturing and inventing enduring multi-species, human and non-human kindreds. We take this to mean the ways in which human and non-human others are always in relation to ensuring mutual flourishing. Activating human responsibilities towards mutual flourishing requires different kinds of practices that seek to disturb human beings as saviors of the earth. This human-centric notion of saving the planet, which is often located in educational programs for children and young people and is focused on saving the Earth's future through a series of superficial techno-fix solutions. This focus situates children as future citizens with the impossible burden of fixing the planet rather than as capable in the present to engage with deep, complex environmental justice ideas. So when we're thinking about this, we're engaging with environmental justice generates this image of the child as capable, and in particular, what Rinaldi calls children as citizens of the now. And in Carlo Rinaldi's words, the child is not a citizen of the future. He is a citizen from the very first moment of life, and also the most important citizen because he represents and brings the possible. A statement for me that is without rhetoric. The child is the bearer here and now of rights, of values, of culture, the culture of childhood. He's not only our knowledge about childhood, but the childhood's knowledge of how to be and how to live. It is our historical responsibility not only to affirm this, but to create cultural, social, political, and educational contexts which are able to receive children and dialogue with their potential for constructing human rights. So connecting to this image of the child, connecting this with learning with place calls for teaching and learning that is complex and intentional. In this sense, pedagogical intention, which comes from Nicole Land and Catherine. Anybody else, Catherine?
It's a few people, et al.
et al. The big ideas that are enacted in learning with place pedagogies. This emerges practices necessary to honor children as citizens of the now and construct spaces and time for this intricate and sophisticated work to generate and evolve.
So one of the ways that we've been experimenting with these big ideas and generating pedagogies that come from these big questions with the world around environmental justice and climate change is through a project that Jeanne and I have been leading for the last 5 years. And the Out and About project, you can see the homepage of the website on the screen there. So maybe if you get time, you can take a little look around. But I'll just share a short summary of Out and About. The Out and About project is a qualitative research project located in regional and urban Victoria. So we have a few different sites in primary schools and early childhood centres. It entails teachers, children and researchers walking and spending extended periods of time with their local places, once a week or once a fortnight. There's a slowness present in this work as beach, cliff, creek, bees, and wah, the crow, so that's in the local Indigenous language, wah is the word for crow, and ant become kin through an understanding of the stories, histories, and acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land. In this project, the central idea is that the children are already entangled with more than human relations, and their community is inclusive of histories and stories of place, trees, waterways, landforms, insects, and animals. We recognise that places are never neutral, and in Australia, the land is unceded and holds many layers of the ongoing effects of colonisation. For example, massacre, stolen children, and stolen land. And these stories and ongoing effects are present in the land and society, the human and more the human and human society. Jeanne and I identify as white settler women, so for us this brings particular ethical and political requirements to our work. So it's about thinking with Indigenous knowledges and worldviews in a respectful way, not just consuming them and putting them in our handbags and walking away. It's about a respectful engagement. We take seriously our commitment to make public the tensions that are generated from and with ongoing colonial inheritances. This commitment includes respectfully foregrounding local Indigenous perspectives in teaching and learning, not just as a one-off event during our National Reconciliation Week, but as part of the everyday. So in order to do this work, we are inspired by the concept of coming alongside from Karen Martin, an Indigenous scholar from Queensland in Northern Australia. This concept opens space for non-Indigenous people to engage respectfully with Indigenous worldviews. Martin explains that coming alongside requires time to sit and listen with local elders, time to think with, listen with, and walk with place and the more than human. Engaging with the concept of coming alongside is a relational perspective, and this opens space to consider who we are in relation with beyond exclusively human relationships. Tom Van Doren and Deborah Bird Rose offer the idea of lively multi-species ethnography as a way to engage with human ethical accountabilities to places and earthly others. So an ethnography tends to start with, and I quote here, tends to start with to be provoked by other than human ways of life. The openness of these accounts inevitably draw humans into the frame. End quote. We understand ethnography as a way for humans to activate ethical and moral relations with more than human others, aligning with our intentions within the Out and About project. For this includes using the practices of lively stories, accounts of entanglements and earthly others as part of our multi-species ethnographies.
So part of the work that happened, and this didn't happen in the first few years, this was towards the end of the 4th or 5th year, where some of the children really wanted to make visible the ideas to other people so that they could engage in the same way. They could have other people go out and about. And so what ended up coming out of this was a manifesto that was built in collaboration between Catherine and myself, some of the children participating in the project who are at the time, I think 8 years old, and had been participating since they were 5. So they had been working for several years going out and about in their local community, and the teachers that we had been working with from the start. And so following traditional feminist environmental philosophers, the children created this Out and About manifesto with ourselves as the researchers and the teachers. And they just kind of came up with ideas of things that you had to do if you needed to go out and about. And what was really interesting about it was that it practiced the image of the child as a citizen of now and engaging with how they were thinking about their relationship with local place. And as well as they were strong pedagogical intentions. And they were really activating the political and the ethical accountabilities that were happening within the participation. So you can see the propositions here. And if you go to the website from the previous one, we have a more detailed manifesto of propositions. But these propositions really became kind of how they were thinking about going out and about. And so I think now we want to just share a lively story. How's our time, Catherine?
Yeah, about 5 minutes, I think, 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay. All right, so the first, this first story actually is about activating Proposition 1, building a relationship with place and the more than human. Feet walking, feet moving slow and fast, feet stop as hands retie shoes. Groups of feet traveling down the hill to Fisherman's Beach. Calmness, slow movement, movements marking our journey. An anticipation of going out and about fills the air of each of us as we're returning to the place that we know. Ocean sits at the bottom of hill, calling us into connection. Blues of all shades sparkle with the winter sun. Warmth covers our bodies as the unseasonal warm day in the cooling season of Gangwagam Moron, the season of the honeybees. Country should be cooling down following summer, yet today, sun reminds us of summer. Ocean seems to soak in sun too, moving, changing blues, and calling us to visit. Tree growing on the grass next to Fisherman Breets holds a memory for us. Cool, covered underneath, we know this place where we find another connection to the place. Branches stretch towards the sun, and for a moment, we stop and join branch, sitting and touching with bark. Continuing on, feet move to the usual spot on Fisherman's Beach. Memories of this place from our visits when we were 6 and 7 years old join us as 11 and 12-year-olds on this visit. Maybe because we have just joined the current 6 and 7-year-olds on this visit, or maybe because we remember what we thought with this place previously. Time has given us today, time to walk with place, time to find out what calls us into connection. Something is different today. Reef has emerged from ocean, making visible rock pools. This is something we've never seen before in our previous visits. Feet move with reef into rock pools. Rock pools water move across toes, hands, legs, shoes. Crabs emerge from sand under the water, moving away from us. Sand with hands is a safe place for a crab, as scooping becomes our hope of spending time with crab. Crab seems scared or maybe angry. Hands bring crab back with her home. Last time, crab hotels populated the beach, all made by humans. Have we begun to understand crabs actually already have homes? Are we listening with crab now? I think you could do yours, Catherine.
This is about activating Proposition 6, learning with place. It is Winmali Yalambi Gunning, or hot north wind and fish trap season from the Kulin calendar on the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country. The air is hot and dry, and the sound of bees humming in the flowering gum blossoms moves with gentle breeze to me. I am with a group of preschoolers and their teachers, taking our weekly walks with our local place. As we walk, we attend to sky country, waterways, and the land as intentional practices of respectfully foregrounding Indigenous perspectives. We sit by creek and wonder about the fish trap and the eel trap practices of Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. Are there eels swimming with creek today? So just to finish off, activating the propositions in the Out and About manifesto generates meaningful relationships with local places and more than human others. A multi-species ethnographic approach expands the notion of community by decentering the human in encounters with more than human others. Thinking with Indigenous perspectives counters tokenistic practices that often homogenise Indigenous worldviews in educational contexts. Thinking with local place-based Indigenous worldviews disrupts the dominant settler perspectives and respectfully foregrounds Indigenous knowledges. This work must include respectful and genuine relationships with local Indigenous groups, as well as engaging with the tensions that come with the ethical, historical, and political contexts of the local places. Relational understanding of place foregrounds Indigenous perspectives and situates place as an active part of learning. This conceptual difference calls for moving beyond the colonial inscriptions of place, including the recognition of violence committed to places in order to recover Indigenous ways of knowing and being. We're inspired by Tuck and Mackenzie, 2015. This repositioning of Indigenous perspectives at the centre of meaning making acknowledges Indigenous peoples' original and ongoing connections with the land. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I feel a little like, you know, when you have those moments where you're like, well, that's a hard thing to follow. This panel was extraordinary, so thank you all. I have a couple of things that I'm sort of excited about that I was wanting to share in my kind of point here, but also I'd like to be able to just dialogue a little bit with our extraordinary scholars today. I'm going to share a couple slides and then I'm going to turn it off and actually just talk with everyone. And I hope that we'll start this dialogue. You know, one of the things that I hear across all these talks is recognizing how all teaching and learning is political and ethical. And that there is a deep push to recognize how learning environments are a process of determining what and whose knowledge, whose politics and whose ethics. And there are lots of ways that we can think about that. And we've just heard a series of deeply moving and really exciting ways that people are pushing on these models. And I want to elevate for a second. I've been sort of inspired by Dwayne Donald's articulation, particularly at least in the US context, that the motivation for early childhood is deeply connected to a kind of argument about what kinds of humans we should become. And he talks about it as a deeply anthropocentric, deeply individualized, and ultimately what he calls the creation of the homo economics. And what he means is the human model for young people to aspire to be producers of capital. And I heard versions of that throughout. Instead of asking what kinds of human beings do we need to be cultivating in order to produce and cultivate the worlds that we want. And I really appreciate the nuance about it can't only be future worlds. So I hear a lot of demanding an ethics of prolepsis, that as we're imagining what needs to shift, we also have to do the work of being present in the now. And I think that part of why this becomes really important, and I often say that why I think that potentially the most politically important work for us to do is to rethink early childhood and what we do with young children. Because for me, the space between what often is positioned as kind of a kind of version of childhood is deeply connected to the kind of broad scale socio-political contexts that are enabled and are underneath and undergirthed our models of education. And for me, that has been, I articulate that as apart from models of education. I want to say something though, that I think it's really important that at the core of some of what we are talking about and what I've learned from folks like Leroy Littlebear or Sylvia Winter, Greg Gahete, is that underneath part of what we are talking about is a model of human supremacy, and that human supremacy is co-constructed with white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity that has been in the slow development over the past 4 centuries. And I wanted to say this because I think that it comes along with how we think about this. And for me, there's been a deep recognition of what is entailed in our kind of base understandings. And today we heard a series of talks and a series of perspectives about what it means to create educational environments predicated on kin relations. And there's a lot of work to demonstrate how the world, the non-Indigenous world anyway, has moved from kin relations as its originating kind of organization to institutions of, I would argue, white human supremacy and entitled extraction. I think one of the things that is really important about this first is that recognizing, and this is really Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, is the ways that the more than human is turned into natural resource for human entitled extraction. And certainly we've heard that across the talks today. But I think that it is really important for us to continue to think about the language of instruction and the ways that we're actually, how our very formations and interaction happen. And I really appreciated the different details and being able to see both children's words up close, but also some of the different ways people described the transformations of teachers' experiences here. And if people don't know Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, I'm sure most of us do, you know, she talks about in a very generous way about how English encodes human exceptionalisms, really recognizing that as we talk about Indigenous perspectives, we are also talking about the demand for Indigenous language regeneration and what that looks like. And I think our early childhood educators, we have a particularly potentially powerful role in being allies and co-conspirators to Indigenous communities who are working deeply to regenerate their languages. I think I also want to recognize that the apart from models and things that we are talking about is also predicated on an idea of removing and extracting children from our communities. And it has been a key strategy of settler colonial society to remove children from families and communities. And I think it's important for us to recognize, much like I'm trying to push towards a root recognition, that the extraction from children and communities has actually become a global model of schooling. And that global model of schooling is deeply intertwined with capitalist nation state and the needs to prioritize labor and capitalist labor over life. And we also heard that across the talks as different ways of understanding that. And I deeply appreciate the Anthropocene, the anthropause that we've just lived through. For a long time, I was sort of obsessed with the idea if people were recognizing in many countries and in many places, this was the first time in a couple of generations where children and adults and their families were spending elongated time together over many, many months, where schooling hadn't disrupted that temporal configuration. But I've also been quite interested in a lot of the work around unchilding and how it is that the work of extracting children from communities is connected to a particular biopolitical control in colonized spaces. And I really am interested in this work around thinking about unchilding as a claim to the right to maim. That if schools are the places for at least Indigenous children in my work, and I would argue maybe all children, that schooling is a place where our children are routinely maimed. Whether their identities are maimed, their spirits are maimed, their languages are maimed. And that in this continual right to maiming, in the United States, I keep telling people that until we get rid of compulsory attendance laws, like we can't talk about just education, is that it embeds a cruelty of violence and a kind of way of holding childhood captive that both at once creates a conditions of risk for children, but also a rupture to communal life. And so part of the reason I'm saying this is that the returning of education to the kinds of land-based models that I think we heard about today has implications not only for children, but the health and healing across generations in our communities, in part because age segregation is a colonial technology of forgetting. I wanna just stop where it's kind of returning to my, well, actually there's two other things I wanna say. You know, I said this before, but I am moved by Leanne Simpson's work and its connections to Dr. Donald's kind of question about what kinds of humans do we need to be in these times. And Leanne's work around really recognizing that our ancestors' primary concern in educating our young people was to nurture a new generation of elders, right? And that means making sure that we have a kind of collective continuance that that I hear a lot of in Kyle White's work around what it is that we're up to. And I want to give a couple of reflections from the talks and then end with a kind of, I really love that we're telling stories, and I was going to end with a poem because I've been committed to poetry as much as possible lately. About a couple of things that I see in the field that I am really curious about our scholars today and the way that they're thinking about this. So one, I am worried about the term posthumanisms, and I'll tell you why. I think a lot about the term and the positioning and the work that is emerging around posthumanisms and the kind of ethics work that we need to do about the histories of knowledge systems. And here's why. I worry, and I have certainly been schooled by some of my own elders, that posthumanisms reifies a Western knowledge point of reference, because I'm not sure that Indigenous knowledge systems need to be seen as part of a post-human geography. So I worry about how we're reproducing particular points of views, even as we work to transform them. And what I'll tell you is in some relations with particularly scholars in the Black diaspora, in thinking about this, is that not only does it lead to, I think, potentially forms of Indigenous erasure, it can actually reproduce unexamined ways that anti-Blackness and white supremacy are also being carried forward, because we are not actually in a collective human world yet. So I think a lot about that these days and trying to understand the ways that racialization is being played forward in a kind of post-humanist construction. I don't have answers to that, but it's a thing that keeps me up at night sometimes, trying to think through. The other thing that I want to say that Kyle White wrote a recent piece about where he argued against climate urgency. And it's one of those pieces that both names something that I've been experiencing for a good long while and kind of took my breath away because it felt very different than a lot of the arguments I've been hearing. And you all should read his piece called Against Urgency, but I'm gonna tell you a couple of things about what I've been hearing in this. And part of it is connected to this first piece, where he suggests in various ways that an urgent response to climate crisis both erases our histories and potentially erases Indigenous communities' resilience, because in many ways, we have already lived through the kinds of social scale change that we need to do as human species already. And so we have urgencies, or so we have resiliencies and we have expertise in the kinds of social change we need to engage. But I think that he also argues, so he sort of talks about how it leads to solutions like only carbon sequestration or only new energy forms. And the argument is not that, of course, those are necessary, but they could play forward the root cause of our current condition, where we don't reach what Vine Deloria has talked about as a kind of new scale of human maturation. And Vine's way of thinking about human maturation is, how as a species are we learning to be better? Are we growing in our roles and our responsibilities? And I think that part of what Kyle talks about, and I really love the slowing down, because the different ways in which people are taking time here and being careful and deliberate about sets of relations. And Kyle really talks about that there is the urgency response can actually fall back onto species kinds of conversations that, if you look closely at them, look not unlike previous generations that were deeply saturated in racist logics. And I think this is really connected to the points about how we are positioning children and whether they're present human beings in the configuration of our communities and necessary, or we're preparing them for a kind of, where I started, homo economics adult, that is, whose ultimate worth is in our ability to produce labor for capitalist configurations. I think the last thing that I wanted to say is I also think we have some work to do here to think about as educators who are engaging with Indigenous knowledge systems and perspectives, what our ethical responsibilities are to uphold Indigenous sovereignty and make the space for Indigenous self-determination and leadership. And I'll say that as a science educator, so I primarily identify as a science educator, I've been really excited at first around the take-up of recognizing and expanding beyond Western knowledge systems and the engagement in Indigenous knowledge systems. But I am worried that the privilege of being able to engage the knowledge systems without the responsibility of the ongoing political struggles for our right to exist actually could lead to new forms of extraction and appropriation of our knowledge systems that ultimately actually will lead to colonial enclosures again. So I wanna ask us all what that means for us, both in our interactions with children and the ways that we're creating and engaging learning environments, as well as families and communities. I think that the holding up of the act of raising children as being an act of self-determination and being in intellectual and emotional and ethical relations with even the youngest of children is a form of story making and a form of world making. And for me, there's been this deeper question about the ways in which we think about our ethical pedagogies. What does that really mean? And I really appreciate, I am deeply concerned about the kind of climate anxiety and the ways in which we're constructing gloom and doom, end of world kinds of messaging to young people. In fact, in some of the work that I've been doing by kindergarten, children have scorched earth models. And the idea that a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old would have a view of Earth's demise as their core model of ecological systems means that we're really not engaging in very ethical ways in the kinds of stories and songs we're telling about the world. And I would argue it's a kind of loss and greed that is birthed of particular paradigms that steals power. And so what I want to leave you with is one of my favorite poems by Lee Miracle that is that she calls Everything Begins with Song. So the sweet mountain breath of wind whispering through cedar or symphony, wind taps out tunes to the valley floors. Even the howling storm wind sings agonizingly beautiful. Songs, our eyes of painful transformation we come to love. Songs hooked to the language of wind's lessons that burden this burden of being, coupled itself to the promise of language. Voice elevates being, renders life manageable. There is power in the breath we pass over vibrating vocal cords. The words carry a charge. The spark invites response. The hum of song points receivers in the direction of the good life. The breath of others takes their own journey through the body, passes breath through some imagined future. So I just want to end today by really thanking our panelists for sharing images of the possibilities of what we could be doing as early childhood educators in a number of ways that holds the deep ethical responsibility of our lives in these times. So thank you. Miigwech.
Okay, so I'm going to take over from Megan. Thank you so much, Megan. That was, along with the speakers, absolutely fantastic to listen to. My name's Sonia Arndt from the University of Melbourne, and I'm opening up to questions now to all the listeners. So please use the Q&A function now to post your questions to any of the speakers, and we'll go through and answer what we can in the time that we have remaining. Please don't be shy. And it might be that anybody pick up on some of the points that Megan's just posed in the worries. I think, Megan, they're absolutely spot on, and some people have already said in the comments that this is exactly right. Indigenous people were already post-human, and there have been some thanks here mentioned. Megan, there's a question whether you could please share the title for Donald's article or book chapter. That would be great. And there's a question.
I will put it in the chat right now.
Sorry, Megan.
I'll put that in the chat in just a second.
Great, thank you. There's a question for Catherine and Jeanne. To hear Catherine and Jeanne's take on how post-humanism might work with Indigenous knowledges. Do you feel it's a hopeless cause? Catherine.
Where's that, Jeanne? I'll go for it. Thanks for your question, Angela. Yeah, we typically don't use, I guess, the post-human term in our work, and it would be for exactly the reasons that Megan outlined. So I guess from our perspective, it's a relational approach. It's about engaging with our more than human kin. So I think that generates the opportunities to think then with Indigenous world views. I think we've fairly intentionally been inspired by the concept of more than human rather than post-human. Jeanne, do you want to add anything to that?
And I think it relates a little bit to this framework that we've been playing with called learning with place. Do you think, Catherine? Like I think we've been trying to move and grow with what we've been thinking about, and maybe looking at it as this way where place is the provocation, and then I think that kind of resituates us maybe away from that post-human. But I don't know. I don't think we've used it here and there, but it's definitely not been the first thing that we've referred to. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think just to maybe add to that, we've also been playing around with this term ethnography, not ethnography, ethnography. From Deborah Bird Rose and Tom Van Doren. So this idea that being in relation begins by being called into connection with a more than human, and then the relational approach happens. So I suppose that we are drawing on their inspiration and using that same, I guess, terminology of more than human kin. So I guess that's how we position ourselves too.
And I think it also comes in line with the practice of coming alongside, with Martin's idea of coming alongside. And I think that's often where we begin, because we're entering this work as white settler women.
Yeah, and I think even Bradotti, to add a little bit into the conversation, plays around with the concept in relation to where it's coming from politically and ethically. So it's certainly not a concept that is defined, in my view at least, or in how I've used it also, is not defined in just one way. But absolutely, Megan, I've written down pages of questions in relation to what you brought up as your provocation. So I'm going to work on that some more. I'm going to finish with one question because I'm very conscious of the time. So this is a question that is open to all speakers. It asks, how is your research addressing the human-centric position of the stories told, being that they're all from human perspectives and with human voice? I wonder about how post-humanism can decenter the human when it is from a human position. So that kind of carries on from your responses, Catherine and Jean. I wonder if the other speakers have a response to this.
So Sonia, I'll give a quick response and then maybe pass it on to others. For the work that the snippets of the work that I shared about today from this greater project, I didn't talk about the role of storying that's involved and threaded throughout, but it is. And I guess I would say that the stories told in the work that we're doing are not all from the human perspective. That many, if not most, stories that are included within the curriculum that we're working on are from the more than human perspective, or include multiple perspectives from humans and more than humans interacting together. And so I would maybe want to hear from Lauren, like how that shift of thinking maybe shifts the question around the post-humanism aspect of it. And I'm also wondering how Megan thinks about this in the work that Megan does to look at apart of or apart from frameworks, and if we're looking as human peoples as a part of more than human environments and relations through this story work, how we think about it that way.
Sure, thanks, Anna. Megan, did you want to add something to that?
Well, so I think part of the reason I think the frame of kin relations is really important, and for me, why recognizing the roots of human supremacy is really important, is because in the very microfibers of thought, we often replicate the idea that more than humans don't have communicative capacity of their own. Or that they aren't already engaged in a range of communication. So I'm not sure it's our job to speak for them. It's rather, how are we speaking with folks? And Oscar Wilde taught me this a long time ago, is that part of the reason that we need all of our languages is that our languages and our places give us actually ways into understanding what it means to listen and hear. What it is that more than humans are sharing with us. And I think sometimes we get really quick into actually replicating a particular view of a relation. And so just to say that, I think the other thing is, at least in my own ways of seeing things and my teachings as I understand them as an Ojibwe woman, is that I am supposed to understand my role and my relation with the rest of the world. And I think we're supposed to teach children that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with developing actually a human language that is actually in relation. So sometimes I feel like we're supposed to do, and I actually really nerd out on multi-species ethnographies, but I worry that there's a slippage to a construction of more than humans personhood that actually is still seeped in an idea that the only intentional communicative beings on the planet are humans. So the other thing that I wanted to say just quickly is there was a question here about how you do this with teachers. And I'll just say how I do this with teachers is my teacher prep is outdoors. Like I think that one of the problems is we think that place-based education, and this is what a distinction is for me between place-based education and land-based education. I'm not talking about field trips to places. I'm talking about actually our learning environments no longer being centered in buildings. Now we went into buildings too, so I'm not against being inside buildings, but our center of gravities and our projections forward about possible replicate an indoor paradigm in a lot of ways still. And it turns out actually human beings notice a whole lot more about the natural world when they're outdoors, and we're not talking about representations of it. Like our whole entire cognitive and neural patterns shift when we're outdoors. Turns out when teachers try to imagine teaching the kinds of complexity that we're talking about, that learning to do it in and with places, alongside places, rather than about them, actually opens up all kinds of new pedagogical practices too. So usually what I tell people to do is like, go walk around whatever building you think you're supposed to be in every day for 30 minutes and start thinking about what the place affords. What are you learning from the place if you start close noticing? Doesn't matter where. I started place-based teaching, land-based teaching in the alleys of Chicago. And very quickly I realized all of my traditional medicines grow in the cracks of pavement in the city of Chicago because their seeds have actually endured through literally the layers of colonialism that leads to urban build. But they're there if we remember to see them.
Yeah. And I think that was what, Jenny, you portrayed. Actually, it came through in all of the talks, but it was what you started with, Jenny, and that was beautiful in there as well. I'm again going to come, so we're over the time that we advertised, but I am being given permission to carry on with, there is one more question in here that I want to know. There are several more questions in here that I could move forward with. And what I'd like to do is perhaps open up one more question, and then we'll slowly transition everybody who would like to or who can stay on into the salon time, where it'll be a lot more free, and we can have a discussion as much as we can in this online virtual world. So I'd invite you to stay online with us, and some of us will in the behind the scenes be changing you over to become a panelist, which means that you'll be able to have conversations with us. In the meantime, there is a comment here that says, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham University, Kehinda Andrews, states that the quest for allyship is in itself misguided. The problem is that society is built on a white supremacy that permeates every institution, intellectual framework, and interaction within it. If you have come this far and believe that white people offering a meaningful hand of friendship is the solution, then you have missed the points. Any thoughts on this? So Megan, I think, is responding to that, which I'll be able to convey to you in a moment. If anybody else has any thoughts on this idea, I think it's kind of permeated quite strongly the ideas that have come across already. Did any of the speakers want to say something to that in the meantime? Jenny?
I just came this morning from an event which was a signing of it's not actually even an English word, it's a signing of a Pākai here, which was led by the two iwi in this region, two tribes, Te Aotearoa and Ngāti Toa Rangatira, in response to an invitation from the Teaching Council, which is the body in New Zealand that oversees all of the teaching profession, including teacher education. And this is an understanding that that we're going to work. It's a metaphor of the two held waka, and it's a way of moving forward with our planned leadership space, which is going to be co-created but led by Māori. So I think that for me, the key is that the Indigenous leadership is calling the shots, and that the non-Indigenous are supporting the direction that has been determined by the Indigenous party to the relationship. So that was what came to mind because I was actually at the signing this morning.
Yeah. Anybody else have some comments to make there? On that notion of, Catherine.
Sorry, I think that's a really important point to consider, and I think the notion of ally is different depending on where you are. So I guess for me working in Victoria, Australia, we have an early years learning framework which foregrounds Indigenous worldviews and cultural knowledge stories right up front. And the expectation is that all teachers will work with those cultural knowledge stories with all children, not just Indigenous children. And again, to echo Jenny's point, those cultural knowledge stories were presented in the framework from Indigenous early childhood scholars. And then it's about non-Indigenous people following the direction that has been set by Indigenous elders. So that's something that we have, we've still got a lot more work to do, but that's something that we have the opportunity to do in our local context here in Victoria.
Yeah, and there's a number of questions here that relate to how that looks in practice. So first of all, I want to say that there are a number of questions also that are saying a huge thank you to all of the speakers. So I don't want us to leave the talk before having said that. Huge thank yous, claps, and more thanks. And questions about, and this is, I'm kind of putting a few of them together here. How can that work in practice when there are so many cultures in our various places that have been torn away from their own place or from a range of individuals? And how can we make distinctions between place-based education and land-based education? Don't know if there are some comments around that anybody would like to add. And then earth-centric education.
Well, I'll say one thing quickly. I don't think a 3-year-old or 4-year-old or 5-year-olds have codified relations to lands yet. So I think that when we start talking about what's possible for new generations of children based on adult histories only, we foreclose actually the points about children being new generations. And for me, actually, in my own context, theories of change that start with adults or start a logic from grown-ups is actually a pattern of thought of the West that I've really worked hard to say. I say it all the time. So what does that mean for a 4-year-old or 5-year-old? My 4-year-old grandchild doesn't know all of Indigenous knowledge systems. That's a life course journey. Mm-hmm. So I'll just say that. I think there's also a really important question here, though, about the difference between place and land that I think we should continue to get clear about for folks, because land-based education for me comes with an ethical and political responsibility that is often not articulated in place-based education.
Yeah. So I see that quite a lot of people have now been made panelists, which means that slowly people can be joining the conversation. We will also be stopping the recording at the point where everybody has been made a panelist. So then it'll just be an open discussion. The recording of this session will be placed up on the website, on the Ritchie website. So where you went to register is also the website that you'll be able to come to pick up the recording and have access to that. I'd also just